Good morning. I am joining this hearing remotely as I am recovering from a COVID infection. I appreciate that my remote participation may require a bit of patience and forbearance on everyone's part, and I'm very grateful in anticipation of that. You will also notice that neither of the assessors is present in the hearing room. Mr. Raju Bhatt is not available this week and intends to catch up with the recording in due course. Mr. Michael Fuller has arranged to follow proceedings remotely this week. Let me now turn to the witness. Mr. Nicolson, your evidence will be taken by Senior Counsel to the inquiry, Ms. Graham KC, whom I think you will already have met. Before that, could I ask you to raise your hand and say the words of the oath after me? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That I will tell the truth.
That I will tell the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr.
Good morning.
Nicholson. You are Ruaraidh Nicolson?
I am.
And what age are you?
I'm 62.
You joined the police, as I understand it, in 1983.
I did.
And you retired on the 31st of October 2016.
That's correct, yes.
And when you retired, what rank had you reached?
I was Deputy Chief Constable for Police Scotland.
Thank you. And I think in 2015, am I right in saying you had 32 years service?
Yes, so in July of 2015 I would have had 32 years service, that's correct, yes.
And in 2015, I think you were an Assistant Chief Constable.
I was, yes.
So we've heard a lot of people talking about ACC Nicolson. Was that you?
That was me, yes.
There's a folder in front of you on
Yes.
the bench. Would you have a look at it? It's black. We've collated a number of hard copies of documents. And what I'm going to do in a moment is just go through all of these documents to make sure that we've got everything you might need today. If there's anything missing, please let us know, and what we'll do is we'll try and get hard copies during a break. But feel free to use it, to refer to it if you prefer. Now, in addition, there's a screen in front of you, and when I ask you to look maybe at a paragraph in your inquiry statement, I'll ask for that to be brought up on the screen.
Okay.
But the screens are quite small, so we might only be able to see the paragraph. There might be other things around it that you would find helpful to refer to. And so you've got the hard copy, and if you want me to bring anything up on the screen, just let me know, and we can arrange that.
Thank you.
I'm sure you'll get used to that as we go through.
Thank you.
Have you watched any of the evidence in the inquiry at all?
So now and again I have. So when I've seen the news, I've then gone on to see some evidence, but I haven't listened to all the evidence of any individuals, so just dipping in and out, I would say.
But you've maybe seen the process.
So I've seen the process, and yeah, it was
so
important.
It might be familiar to you.
It is.
All right. Let's look at what I believe is the first document there, which is a statement. I think you refer to this actually in your inquiry statement. The reference I have for it is Perk 00731. And we can maybe put just the first page on the screen, and you'll see it's handwritten. Do you have that
I do,
in your
yes,
folder as well?
I do.
So is this your writing?
It is my writing, yes.
Thank you. And I think, am I right in saying the date there is given as 21st of June 2005? But
Yes,
I wonder if that should have been 2015.
It definitely should have been.
Yeah. I'm like that myself with dates. And then the time is 1400, so 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
That's correct, yes.
And is this a statement that you prepared yourself?
It is, yes. So
We've heard some people call these operational statements. Is that
that's correct, yes.
right? So that is a copy of your operational statement that you prepared on the 21st of June 2015.
That's correct, yes.
And do you remember why you prepared that statement?
I think I was asked for it by the Perk.
And does it set out your recollection of your involvement with the investigation into Mr. Bayoh's death?
It-
And were you doing your best to be accurate and truthful?
I was, yes.
Thank you. And if there's any difference between what you say today and what you've got here, would the chair be better to refer to your original operational statement or your evidence today?
Well, this was taken nearer the time, so my recollection would be much better at that stage than it would be today.
We've heard a lot of witnesses say that because that was written so close to the events or closer to the events and now, sometimes their memory is better then. Is that the same for you?
Yeah, that's it, yes.
Thank you. And then let's look at Perk 00317. Now, I think this is a typewritten version of the statement that was in your handwriting. And so it's just a typed version, same date, same time, same location, and written by you as well.
Yeah,
And is that correct?
yeah, so it's been typed up, but I see my first name has been spelled incorrectly, so
Right. So there might be
it's a
some-
typographical error.
Yeah, all right. Thank you. But subject to that,
But other than that, that's my statement.
it's the same statement.
Absolutely is, yeah.
And that was prepared by you at the request of Perk.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And then let's move on to the next document in your folder. And this is Inquiry Statement SBPI 00217.
Yes.
Now we see this on the screen. Now you'll see that there's redactions
Okay.
on the screen, but I think your copy probably isn't redacted.
First page is redactions, but
All right. Well, you may have the redacted version as well.
I think I do,
You
definitely,
do,
yeah.
all right. So it was taken by the inquiry team on the 7th of October last year. And then if we look, it's 68 pages long. If we look at the final paragraph, 346, that's right at the bottom. And you'll see that coming up on the screen.
yes.
And it says, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website.
Yes,
And as I understand it, you signed all the pages
I did.
of this, knowing that it would be published on the website
Yes.
and saying that the facts stated in there are true.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And you signed that on the 27th of December 2022,
Yes,
the end
that's
of last
correct.
year.
Yes.
I take it on the 27th of December it was done online through the system.
It was done online, yes.
Thank you. Now, I appreciate that you've been retired for nearly 7 years. And what I'm interested in is events in 2015, because you're not a serving police officer now.
No.
And I'm interested primarily in what was happening in 2015 and your best recollection of the events then. All right?
Yes, that's,
We know from other evidence that we've heard in the inquiry, you didn't go to Hayfield Road on the 3rd of May 2015 when the events were taking place.
no, not.
But you were appointed as Gold Commander
That's
in
right.
relation to that incident.
That's correct, yes.
Now, I will come on to that and ask you a bit more about the role of Gold Commander. But in relation to, I wonder if you can help me in relation to the incident itself. Now, the chair has heard, oh, I've just realised I forgot to ask you something. It should also be in your folder. Scope records.
Mhm.
It might be at the back.
So my
A
career,
hard copy of scope records showing your appointments and training and things like that.
yes, it's at the front
Have
of the
you
folder.
got that as
I
well?
have, yes, I have.
Thank you. Sorry, that was my mistake, and then I just saw a scribbled note I'd left myself. Let's go back to the as I was saying, the chair's heard a lot of evidence about who's in charge of the incident. And we've had different answers given by different witnesses, and I'm hoping you can clear this up for me. From your perspective as ACC Nicholson at the time, in May 2015, who was in charge of the incident? Now, we've heard
Yes.
that the response team were deployed to Hayfield Road, that this acting police sergeant who was with that response team was called Sergeant Maxwell,
Yes.
and he attended with them, that the police incident officer was Inspector K, Acting Inspector K. He was in Kirkcaldy. I'll come on to his role later. But you've said in your inquiry statement at paragraph 94, let's put that on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
So that's paragraph 94. So we've heard different witnesses have said Sergeant Maxwell,
Yes.
Acting Inspector K, and you've said Gary McEwen was in charge of the incident at paragraph 94.
Yeah.
And I just wonder who was in charge.
Well, so it would escalate up the way. So initially you would have the incident, and fairly obviously police officers on the ground. You'd have their sergeant that would be looking after them, and then it would escalate up the way, inspector. Then the police incident officer would become involved in it. And thereafter, once what happened unfolded, then Gary McEwen would become involved. And then once he became involved, I would expect that he would be directing resources, understanding what was going on, knew where the police officers were at that point. So it would work up the way, up to the very top to Gary McEwen, and then he would delegate responsibility down the way.
Right. Well, I'll have more questions about all of that later.
Yeah.
But when the incident was ongoing,
Yes.
who was technically, formally in charge of the incident at the time so calls start coming in at 7:10 in the morning,
Yes.
emergency calls from the public.
Yes.
At 7:16, the ACR deploy officers to Hayfield Road.
Yes.
At 7:17, Acting Police Sergeant Maxwell
Yes.
makes a request, which I'll come on to later.
Yes.
And then the officers arrive at 7:20 at Hayfield Road. So when that's happening, who formally
Well, the
is in
sergeant
charge?
initially. The sergeant initially, and then when the PIO attends, then the PIO will become in charge of the individuals on the ground and the ongoing situation.
We've heard some evidence that the PIO, Inspector K, would be in charge of the incident really from the time that the calls are coming in, the team are deployed, that he's actually in charge. Do you agree with that or not?
Well, he would have to deploy to the location itself. So for the initial response, police officer attending, and then the sergeant would be in charge. And then as soon as it's understood what's actually happening and the PIO is going to attend, then he will be responsible for and in charge of the police officers on the ground.
So is that from the time that he arrives at the scene? That the PIO is in charge, or prior to that?
Well, I mean, it would be really difficult. So presumably he's at an office somewhere, and then he goes to deploy to the scene. So I suppose it would be difficult to argue that he can take charge of it while he's actually moving, but as soon as he's there in a position to take charge, then he needs to take charge.
All right, thank you. We'll probably come back to that as we're going through. I think we heard evidence from Gary McEwen that he envisaged the PIO listening to the calls, listening to the radio transmissions. He'd have a computer screen in front of him.
Yeah.
You'd maybe see the storm cards, as we've heard them called, or call cards. And he would have a watching brief at that point over the incident, making sure he's happy with what's going on.
Yes, if he was aware that the incident was ongoing, then you'd expect that, yes. But I don't know.
We've heard that Inspector Kay was aware of the incident
Right, okay.
going on.
Yep.
All right, thank you. So if he was aware of the incident, do you think a watching brief at that stage was a reasonable description?
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah, all right. I think we heard from Inspector Kay that he was waiting for more information before he got involved. Is that a reasonable approach to take if you're a PIO?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So it depends on the circumstances, and we need to understand that. Yeah, I haven't heard his evidence, but we need to understand from him what information he was waiting for, what else he required before he would deploy to the
Right.
to the scene.
Well, the chair's heard from Inspector Kay. Thank you. Can I ask you about other evidence that we've heard? The sergeant who was Sergeant Maxwell, who went along with the response team, he was acting. He made a request at 7:17 that morning for an ARV and a dog unit, and all units to attend. Now, we've heard evidence that it wasn't a decision for a sergeant to make as to whether to deploy an ARV, but that a request could be made by the sergeant for that, which is what he did. I'm interested in your views about a situation where there are multiple calls coming in from the public. We've heard that there were 6 calls, one person phoned twice. There's an incident created where a man is said to be in the street and he has a large knife. And the police sergeant makes a request for an ARV and a dog unit and all units to attend.
Yes.
We've heard that the calls were largely grade 1, high risk incident. Do you consider it, in your experience, to be significant that a sergeant for a response team would make that request for an ARV and a dog unit and all units to attend?
No, I think that's sensible. It's a sensible response to what he understands to be unfolding, and it fits into the definition for the deployment of a firearms response.
And what would you expect to happen once that sensible response has been made or the request has been made by the sergeant?
So I would expect an ARV to be located wherever that would be, a dog vehicle to be located wherever that would be, and ask them to attend to be in close proximity to the location if they possibly could. That doesn't mean to say that they've got authorization to deploy with firearms. That requires authorization. So, but there's no reason why an ARV couldn't attend to be in the vicinity of the incident.
And we've heard that the duty inspector at Bilston Glen would have authority to actually deploy the ARV with firearms.
Yeah.
And what would you expect him to do in relation to that if the ARV's been deployed to attend the area?
Well, so he would look for feedback from the officers that were on the ground about what was happening, and if it was deemed necessary to have the actual ARV with firearms deployed, then he would go through the model, the risk assessment model, and decide whether that was an appropriate response to what was unfolding.
How long do you envisage that process taking?
That process wouldn't take very long. So the first thing would be to get the RVs heading for the location, the scene, and then secondly to authorise. I don't envisage that would take very long.
Can you help the chair understand what you mean when you say not very long? Can you help give us, I'm not going to hold you to a precise number of seconds, but can you help the chair understand or get an impression of the timescale?
Yeah, so the inspector would need to get the detail, the information, the intelligence, everything that was known about the incident, about the individual, and then do the risk assessment, understand whether, in fact, it was pertinent to authorise firearms. So I think that 10 minutes would be, it could take longer, and it would depend on how long it takes to get, all the information that's required, but it shouldn't take much more than 10 minutes or thereabouts.
And during that period, from what you're saying, do you envisage that the ARV would be heading to the
ARV could be heading. The ARV doesn't need to be authorised to move to a location.
All right, thank you.
So it's like any other police vehicle with 2 officers in it. So it can move wherever it wants to move to, or where it's instructed to move to.
Thank you. Can I ask you, in relation to the PIO heading to the scene, how long, we've heard that the journey from Kirkcaldy Police Office to Hayfield Road is about 5 minutes.
Right.
There or thereabouts. When the PIO is aware of the incident, listening to the airwaves transmissions, how long would you think they would take to arrive at Hayfield Road? What would be reasonable? Have you any sense of what that would be?
I would think 10 to 15 minutes. I don't know. I don't know the area at all. But I would expect that they would, when they understand what's happening, it's unfolding, that they would go and prepare themselves, maybe pick up a radio, get car keys, get in a vehicle, and then go to the scene. So if it's 5 minutes away, 10 to 15 minutes might be reasonable.
Thanks. Do you have any impression from your experience that day as to whether this ought to have been declared a firearms incident? We've heard evidence it wasn't declared a firearms incident, and we've heard evidence from the inspector in charge at Bilston Glen that day. Do you have any impression about whether it should have been declared a firearms incident?
Not really. You have to take every incident on its own merits. And very much it'll be dictated by the officers on the ground exactly what they require. But using an ARV or using a dog vehicle, safety of the officers themselves, safety of the individual involved, and the safety of the public. These are the considerations. And so, what do you require, and what are the best assets to be able to deal with that in an efficient and appropriate manner? So. Were they comfortable that they were able to deal with it themselves, or could they have called for other resources? And they could call for other resources. They could have called for a dog vehicle, and maybe they did, and they could have called for an ARV, and it sounds like they asked for one at the very least. So these are the kind of resources that they would use, and in my professional opinion, these are the kind of assets that support you when you've got someone who's carrying a knife, a lethal weapon, and would, help you in terms of resolving or could help you in terms of resolving the incident if you aren't able to resolve it, or you don't feel confident of resolving it yourself with, either baton or CS or handcuffs.
So these are the type of things that you've talked about, the safety of the officers being important and giving support to police officers. Are these the type of things that can help provide that support and protect the safety of police officers?
Yes, absolutely.
And can they have an impact on the way officers feel about approaching an incident such as this, where there's been multiple calls and someone is alleged to have a knife?
Yes, of course. So, you know, they could attend there, observe, stay a safe distance, and then ask for other resources to come and assist if they felt that that was the level it was at. So, observe, have an ARV, have a dog vehicle attend, you know, have, and that supports the police officers in terms of what it is that they're actually having to do. So that's looking after their own safety, because if they can look after their own safety, they look after the safety of the public and the safety of the individual that they're focused on. So
we've heard evidence from two witnesses, a Miss Caffrey and a Mr. Graves, and they've talked about 4 sort of tactical options being open to police officers that day. That a remote rendezvous point, observe, wait and feedback to ACR, which could have been just at the side of the road or along the road a little. So not remote, but not as remote as the first option. There could have been engagement with the subject and attempts at de-escalation. Yep. And a verbal dominance approach where they simply go up and try and get him down on the ground. Certain witnesses have called that a hard stop. Yep. So 4 options: remote viewing point, observe, wait, feedback, de-escalation and verbal dominance. Is that your experience of the options that would be open to officers?
yes, very much so.
Attending a knife incident
Very much
such as
so.
this? Do you have a sense of what would have been the appropriate option for officers to adopt on this day?
No, so that would be part of the investigation to understand exactly what took place and what would be the appropriate response.
From your experience as Gold Commander, did you form any views at any stage?
No, I was trying not to form any views whatsoever. We need to allow the investigation to take place, make sure that's thorough, and get feedback and learn and understand from whatever that investigation, whatever the outcome of that investigation is.
We'll come on to this later, but we've heard about the 3 stages of an investigation, and we've heard about hypotheses being sort of thought of and developed as time goes on in an investigation.
Yes.
Is that familiar sort of language
yes,
to you?
It is, yeah.
And we'll come back to that later today. Let's move on to your own involvement as Gold Commander. I think if we could look at paragraph 89 of your inquiry statement. And you'll see you were asked here about your role on the 3rd of May. Mm-hmm. On the 3rd of May 2015, I got a phone call that a potential incident had happened. I was picking up incidents. Once I'd dealt with that, I made my way to Kirkcaldy. I was engaged when I got the phone call at round about 7:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
Who was the phone call from?
The phone call was from Gary McEwen.
Right. And you said you were engaged when you got the phone call. What do you mean by that?
So I was the on-call officer for the force. And I would be engaged in going through incidents, so we would have a list of overnight incidents. I don't know how many, be different on different days, so 10 or 12 incidents that I would want to know and understand more about, so that we could deploy resources round about the force wherever we required to have those resources. So I got so I was engaged in that So I would first of all be going through the incidents myself, and then I would have phone calls from round about the country from a variety of different people to update and to let me know what resources they had, what the issues were, and what we needed to do as a force to be able to resolve whatever the matter was. So that's what I was engaged with at that time. And I got a phone call from Gary McEwen around about 7:30.
So we've heard by this stage it was Police Scotland and not the legacy forces that had been
That's
in
right,
place
yes.
prior to that.
Yes.
So were you the on-call ACC for Police Scotland
I
or for a
was.
particular area?
No, for Police Scotland.
For the whole of
For
Scotland?
the whole of Scotland.
And so you said you were getting calls about incidents all over the country, that'd be all over?
That's correct, yes.
Right. And when we've heard evidence from Gary McEwen, and when he called you, tell us, did that trigger some actions on your part?
So at that time I was just told that someone was in cardiac arrest after being in police custody, so fairly obviously that triggered in my mind that it was something that I needed to be updated on and understand exactly what was happening.
And what arrangements did you make with Gary McEwen during that call?
I just told him to keep me updated on exactly what was happening. So,
Right.
and then I carried on with, the business that was undertaking. So that was understanding what else was happening in the force with a bit of a focus and understanding of exactly what we were going to face with this incident.
So if the person had recovered and you'd got an update saying all is well, would much more have been done by you that day?
Not in terms of that, unless we required other resources, and that would be a request from Gary McEwen. But I would carry on with what it is that I had been doing round about the rest of the force.
So can you help me understand, when were you appointed as a Gold Commander to this matter?
So, well, actually, when I was told that the person had succumbed, so I felt that we needed a gold structure in place at that stage. So I eventually made my way through to Kirkcaldy and then pulled together the first gold group meeting on that morning.
So we've heard that life was pronounced extinct at Victoria Hospital shortly after 9 o'clock in the morning.
Yes.
And 0904, and that Gary McEwen declared, I should say, a critical incident at 0910.
Yeah.
So I think in his evidence he said he heard that Mr. Bayoh had died at 8 minutes past 9,
Right.
and within 2 minutes he'd declared the critical incident. So can you tell me, when did you hear about Mr. Bayoh dying? So
I heard about it after Gary McEwen obviously heard, so I think it was about 9:15 on that morning.
So by which time Mr. Bayoh's died, Gary McEwen has declared a critical incident.
Yes.
And he then contacts you 9:15
That's it.
to give you the update that you've asked for.
That's right.
And we heard from Gary McEwen that this was the only time he'd ever declared a critical incident in his career at that stage. We've heard that these are quite unusual things, maybe one or two a year. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely correct.
So when you had that updating call from Gary McEwen, what did you do?
So what I did then was just tell him that we would have a goal group meeting as soon as possible. So I would make my way through to Kirkcaldy and we would draw the strands off that together. So and that's what we did. So I think the first meeting was around about 11 o'clock. So we got various individuals who were involved to come together, have the goal group meeting, and then set out the strategy and set out tasks and actions.
Right. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were the ACC And you were on call that day for the whole of Scotland.
Yes.
Does that automatically mean you were going to become Gold Commander?
Most likely, yes.
Right. So were you officially appointed by anyone, or was it the very fact that you're an ACC and you're on call for the whole of Scotland that you take on that role?
Yes, I think that's correct. But I would have had I would have briefed the Deputy Chief Constable, and I would probably, in this instance, have briefed the Chief Constable as well. So, and I would have said that I was going to take Gold Command, which they've obviously agreed with. So.
Right. So we've heard from Gary McEwen that if a critical incident is declared, the Chief Constable of Police Scotland is advised,
Yeah.
because it's such a serious matter.
That's right.
So that was you that advised the Chief Constable and probably the DCC as well.
Yes.
And you've talked about realising you'd need a gold structure, and we've heard from various people about the gold structure, but could you give us just a summary of what your understanding of the gold structure and the benefits of that gold structure would be in terms of dealing with this incident?
Yeah, so we would set up a gold group, and then we would have a number of individuals there representing investigation, community reassurance, and the divisional response, and then set out the strategy so that everybody knew and understood what it is that we expected of them, and then expect them to deliver that. So from a strategic, and that would be my area of business, tactical and operational point of view. So, so I would set out the strategy at a tactical point. From a tactical point, they would set out how that would be undertaken, and then operational, it would be the day-to-day business. So, exactly what was required to be done.
So, you were gold. You're at the top of the structure.
Yeah,
And your role is to develop strategy.
that's correct.
And is that with the support of the people lower down the structure than you?
Yes, it's with the support of.
And we've heard that Gary McEwen was Silver Commander.
Yes.
And there's only one Silver?
Well, so Leslie Bowl may well also have been Silver. So you had the two, one in charge of the division and public reassurance, and the other in charge of investigation.
Sorry, say that again. One Silver was Gary McEwen.
Yeah.
What was he responsible for?
So the division and public reassurance.
And are you sure that Leslie Bowl was a second Silver Commander?
Well, I assume she was, but
Right. And when you say you assume, is that because you can't remember
I can't remember
that
Yeah.
far back?
Yeah.
Right. And from your recollection of the 3rd of May 2015, what was your recollection about the role, not the title, but the role that Leslie Bowl was taking?
So, so she was on call for the force in terms of the CID. So, and then she supported. I suppose she deployed Pat Campbell as the SIO, and then she supported Pat Campbell in terms of the investigation, in the initial part of it anyway.
Right, thank you. So we've heard from Leslie Bowl, and she said she helped support Pat Campbell.
Yeah.
If there were requests for resources or anything along those lines, she
Yeah.
would endeavour to provide him with the support he needed.
Yeah.
In terms of her role in relation to the investigation, what's your recollection about any specific tasks that she did, or?
No, I don't recall anything specific. I mean, she's supported the SIO.
Right. We've then heard that there are, as well as gold and silver, there are bronze commanders.
Yeah.
Do you remember who they were?
So, well, Pat Campbell, Nicola Shepherd,
we know that Pat Campbell was the SIO,
Yeah, that's right.
so in charge of the investigation.
That's right.
What was Nicola Shepherd in charge of?
So, community reassurance.
Anyone else?
Can't recollect
Can't
just now.
remember. We've got the minutes, we'll come to
Yep,
those
no
later
problem.
on today. Now, you've explained to us that as Gold, you were in charge of strategic decisions. Who was in charge of tactical decisions? You've talked about strategic, tactical and
Yeah,
operational.
so Gary McEwen.
So Gary McEwen, tactical.
Yeah.
And would it just be Gary McEwen?
Right, yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry, I...
Yes, no, that's right.
Is that okay? And then operational.
Yeah, so the SIO. And
So is that the bronze
that's,
commanders?
that's it, yeah.
Right. So effectively, is it strategic for Gold, tactical for McEwen, silver, and operational for bronze commanders?
That's it.
And in terms of strategic decisions, can you explain to us how you determine what the strategic decisions will be, how they will develop?
Well, so it would just depend on the incident. So, so just looking at the various facets of the incident and what it is that required to be delivered on at that strategic level. So,
Okay. So the Gold structure was put in place effectively by you after Mr. Bayoh had died
yes,
and after a critical incident had been declared.
that's correct. Yes.
In relation to the declaration of a critical incident, I think in your inquiry statement you say that it can happen either McEwen would phone you and say, I want to declare a critical incident, or he can tell you afterwards. And it can happen both ways. But what would the normal course of action be if someone's declaring a critical incident?
Well, I think at that level it's absolutely fine for Gary McEwen to declare it. It's a senior officer, so you know, in this instance, it was a critical incident. The truth was, whether it was me or whether it was Gary McEwen or whether it was anyone else, I don't think it matters that much because it was a critical incident. There's no question about that.
And tell us, we've heard from Gary McEwen that there was no doubt in his mind, but tell us why you're saying it was a critical incident in such a confident way.
Well, it fits directly into the definition for a critical incident. So,
and did that, Gary McEwen told us he was thinking about this as a possibility once he knew that Mr. Bayoh was so unwell and was being taken to the hospital. When you had that initial conversation with Gary McEwen, where you asked for the update, was that something that was going through your mind?
yeah, well, it would be, but at that time, you know, you're just waiting to see what unfolds and how it unfolds.
And can you help me understand, is there a relationship or a connection between a critical incident and a Gold command structure, or are they not connected necessarily?
So if it's a critical incident, then there would be a Gold command structure.
But not necessarily the other way about.
You could
We
have a
heard
Gold-
from Leslie Bowl that she sometimes used the Gold command structure. She found that very helpful, although there wasn't a critical incident declared.
Yes, that's absolutely correct, yes. So you can have many Gold group meetings managing incidents that aren't critical. That's right.
Thank you. Now, I think you've explained to us what was happening after your call with Gary McEwen, and then you heard at 9:15 about the critical incident and the death of Mr. Bayoh. We've heard that again, thinking about who was in charge, and we've talked about who's in charge of the incident. So from the point you become Gold Commander and you're setting up a Gold Command structure, so you've taken that decision at 9:15 in the morning. Who's in charge then from that moment that you've taken on Gold Commander? Does that mean you're then the man in charge?
Well, I take responsibility at that point for what goes on, but fairly obviously I was through in Glasgow, and everything and everybody was in Kirkcaldy, so it would be difficult to take charge of everything that's going on in Kirkcaldy at that stage. So I would expect Gary McEwen to be in charge of the various resources that are there at that point in time until we brigade together what's required to actually start the investigation.
So Gary McEwen has been updated and involved at that stage. You're still in Glasgow.
Yes.
Do you really need to be in Kirkcaldy and have a proper handover before you can take charge of the situation? We've heard about other officers being given handovers.
Well, I think that what happens is I move myself from Glasgow to Kirkcaldy, and then I sit over the top of what's actually happening. So, and then we set up the goal group meetings, set out the strategy, understand what's happening, and then make sure that the inquiry, public reassurance, all that's on track. So I would really be over the top of the structure that's already in place, or the structure that's developing, because we wouldn't have had all the resources available to us at that early stage. So we'd be still waiting for a number of resources to complete the picture.
Now, we've heard that there was a teleconference at 9:30 that morning, which is a sort of customary meeting that takes place. Did you have that when you were still in Glasgow?
So that was with me, was it? Is that?
Yes,
Yeah.
well, as I understand it.
Yes,
But
yep, that's.
my understanding from the other evidence is that Gary McEwen talked about having a teleconference at 9:30.
Yeah.
Do you remember if, once you said you'll be Gold Commander, if you then travelled to Kirkcaldy straight away, or was it after?
That obviously didn't. If we had the teleconference at 9:30, I would have travelled immediately after that. So.
Right. What time did you arrive in Kirkcaldy?
Before 11 o'clock, but I don't remember exactly.
Would your original operational statement help you with that?
It might.
Do you want to have a look at that? I don't have a hard copy.
Yeah, so what it says is, having concluded other on-call duties, I attended a Kirkcaldy police office where I convened a series of gold group meetings, which were minuted.
All right. Well, and do you have any recollection of arriving at Kirkcaldy?
No, not at all.
No. All right. If we look at paragraph 95 of your inquiry statement, this is, it says, at the Gold Group meetings, we had people there that represented each area of policing, some local and some national individuals. Myself and Gary McEwen would have a conversation about who was in charge. I think Pat Campbell was the on-call detective superintendent for the area. He naturally became the SIO, and if he comes out to deal with the situation anyway, there's no decision to be taken there. So we'd heard that Leslie Bole had appointed Pat Campbell.
Yep.
So you say there, myself and Gary McEwen would have a conversation about who was in charge. Do you remember that conversation?
Well, I don't really know, but presumably what we were doing was making sure that we had individuals in charge of each area that we required. So Pat Campbell in charge as the SIO, as the SIO, and Nicky Shepherd, I think, in terms of community reassurance.
So it's a conversation about who else was in charge, not between you and Gary McEwen.
No.
That you're the Gold Commander.
That's right.
You're
yes.
in charge.
Yeah.
But you're thinking about who you should appoint to the Bronze Commander positions.
That's it.
So this means that Pat Campbell was already appointed by then.
That's right, yeah.
So that decision didn't have to be made?
No.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to clear that up. We've heard that Gary McEwen was the local policing commander for Fife that day. And this obviously was a serious incident, critical incident, involving officers from Fife, and in particular Kirkcaldy. Did you have any concerns about Gary McEwen being in that role when he had that Fife connection, or did that not cause you any concern at all?
No, it didn't cause me any concern at all. I'd known Gary McEwen for quite some time and was quite confident in his ability to be able to objectively manage what was going on. So.
At that time, or at any time on that day, were you aware that the family had said that they knew Gary McEwen and that there was a connection?
I think I was aware at some stage that the family, or that Gary McEwen knew the family.
And did that give rise to any concerns on your part about this connection, perhaps impacting on his objectivity?
It didn't cross my mind at that stage, and I would be very surprised. I would hope that it wouldn't impact on his impartiality or his objectivity.
When did you become aware that Perk were going to be appointed to lead the investigation?
So I think I probably knew at 11 o'clock there had been a conversation with the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. Well, the truth is that I knew they would be involved anyway. They've got a statutory responsibility to investigate this type of incident. So, and secondly, I was told that the Procurator Fiscal had been contacted and had appointed the Perk as the investigators for the incident.
Do you remember when you found out about Perk being appointed?
No, I don't. But I would have known from the moment that I was told that the individual had died that the Perk would be involved.
Do you have any recollection about this teleconference that we've heard about that took place at 9:30 in the morning? We've heard from various witnesses that there was a sort of standing, if I can say that, conference with other officers of the same rank as Gary McEwen to talk about incidents that have gone on in the past 24 hours.
That's right.
Is that correct, that there
No,
was a sort of standing, meeting?
Yes, so
Was that every morning?
that was every morning.
And do you remember the one on the morning of the 3rd of May?
No, sorry.
You don't remember who was there?
It would be the on-call people round about the country, but I'd carried out many of these, and so I don't recollect that one specifically or who was there.
We've heard that a Conrad Trickett was there, and we've heard from Conrad Trickett. He was appointed as post-incident manager.
Yes.
We know he wasn't at the first Gold Group meeting, but he gave evidence about having a conversation and volunteering to be post-incident manager.
Yeah.
Do you remember does that ring any bells for you?
Well, I know that I spoke to Conrad Trickett, and then he was appointed. Well, the situation was that we had a number of police officers in a canteen at Kirkcaldy, and we needed to get a grip of that. And from my perspective, now, he may well have volunteered, I can't remember that, but I felt that someone like that, who had that kind of experience and who would previously have dealt with officers who had been involved in an incident, that was an opportunity for us to get a grip of the officers that were in the canteen, make sure they weren't collaborating, colluding, and also to look after their welfare, because from a Police Scotland perspective, it's important that we look after the welfare of our officers and staff.
You've used a phrase a couple of times there about getting a grip. And just so the chair can understand what you mean by that, what was it that needed to be gotten a grip of?
Well, as I understood it, the officers were in the canteen on their own, perhaps with a Federation representative, but it didn't feel like there was anybody from Police Scotland that was making sure that they weren't talking about the incident, that they weren't colluding, that they weren't collaborating in terms of what had gone on. So I wanted to make sure that there was somebody there, somebody senior there who had experience, knew what they were doing, and could, as I said, take a grip of the situation.
Now, members of the public are listening to this, and they may be interested in, you've used the words collaborating or conferring. What is the concern in general about that?
Sorry.
Or not making sure that's not happening? Why would you want to avoid that happening?
You want the individual officers' objective understanding of what actually happened. So you don't want them talking so that they come up with a story or whatever. Now, I would hope that they wouldn't do that anyway, but we need to make sure, and from a public perception, we need to make sure that that's the case, so that we've got someone there from a senior position that can actually make sure that that's not happening.
And when were you aware that, as you've said, no one from Police Scotland they were on their own and with Fed reps, but no one from Police Scotland was there?
Well,
no one senior?
I can't remember exactly when, but it would have been before I've asked Conrad Trickett to take charge of that situation.
And so was that the primary reason why you wanted Conrad Trickett to be appointed?
It was the primary reason, yeah.
We've heard he had to travel to Kirkcaldy from his base.
Yeah.
Were arrangements made for a supervisor or a senior person from Police Scotland to be put in the canteen with the officers before he arrived?
I can't recollect that.
Is that something that, even looking back now, you think would have been beneficial?
Yes, absolutely.
And you talked about the not colluding, not conferring, and you also talked about welfare. Was this a concern in relation to appointing Conrad Trickett to look after the welfare of the officers?
Yeah. Obviously, they're our staff, and it's incumbent on us, well, I'm saying us, I'm retired, but on Police Scotland to look after the welfare of its staff and its officers. And the investigation will take care of itself. So we need to be mindful of how they will feel at that point, and as I say, look after them, make sure we look after their welfare issues, food, etc. And as I say, support the investigation in terms of what it's going to do, but we'll understand at a later stage exactly what unfolds from the investigation. But at that point in time, we just need to stabilise everything, make sure we look after everybody, and move forward from there.
Can I ask you a little bit about the investigation? You've said it'll look after itself. We've heard that Pat Campbell was the SIO. So when you say it'll look after itself, was that under the direction of Pat Campbell?
Yes, so at that point in time, yes.
Yeah. But you've also used the words that support investigation. To what extent would the appointment of a post-incident manager support the investigation?
Well, so in relation to, looking after the officers, anything that was required from them, so looking at operational statements, and just in general managing and making sure that there was confidence in that we were going to get the objective view of each individual officer.
As Gold Commander, what were your expectations in terms of securing operational statements from the officers who'd attended at Hayfield Road?
Well, the officer, it's incumbent on the officer to provide initial operational statements.
And when you say it's incumbent on the officers to provide these initial operational statements, what was your expectation in terms of how that would look?
Well, my expectation is that each one would have given what's called an operational statement. So it's just a short statement about their deployment on the day and potentially what happened.
We've heard that in terms of post-incident procedures, we heard evidence previously from Conrad Trickett that there are things called basic facts or initial accounts can be obtained.
Yeah.
We've heard others talk about operational statements. What was your expectation that day as to what the officers would provide?
Operational statements.
And you've said basic and you're gesturing. Would that be just a short?
Yes, very short.
And what sort of information did you expect would be included?
Well, what time they deployed at, where they went to, who they engaged with, but just basic. They wouldn't go into a huge amount of detail at that stage.
And would the operational statements have any input or any reference to, let me start that question again. We've heard evidence that it's incumbent on police officers, if they use force, to justify the use of force. Any use of force has to be justified by the individual. And would you have expected that there would have been something from the officers that day which would provide that justification of use of force?
Yeah, so I think there's, there is a use of force forum, so I would expect that would have been completed on the morning at some stage.
On the morning of the 3rd of May?
Yeah. And
would that be by all the officers as well as their operational statement?
So I think that would be...
If they used force, obviously, only the officers who use force.
Yeah, so, it could be part of their operational statements, or they could fill the use of force form in. But I would expect that you would see something in relation to that, either in an operational statement.
And would it have been sufficient in terms of your expectations and what you were looking for, if simply an operational statement had been prepared?
Yes, but if it included some detail of the use of force, yes.
We've heard some evidence that there weren't computers available in the canteen. Would you have been able to facilitate arranging some other way of giving operational statements if officers couldn't access a computer?
Well, it could be handwritten.
And in terms of having the space, a table and space to prepare that, is that something that could have been arranged in Kirkcaldy that day?
I think so. I don't know the office that well, but I'm pretty sure that it could have been.
All right, thank you. We've heard some evidence that the standard operating procedure that deals with post-incident procedures was to some extent adapted, hadn't been used before in this situation.
Yep.
Do you have any recollection about it being adapted and how it was adapted?
Well, Conrad Trickett, in terms of post-incident management, would be in terms of firearms. As so fairly obviously we didn't have at this stage a firearms incident. So, but we were utilising the initial part of it anyway, that took control of the officers in the canteen area. So I felt that was the best way to get a grip of, sorry, I've said that a few times, but get a grip of what was going on in the canteen, and make sure that we stabilised everything and that we provided the best possible response as far as the investigators were concerned. So that's why the post-incident management procedures were instigated.
Can I ask you to look at the SOP, PS 10934?
Do I have it in here?
Now, you won't have a hard
Okay.
copy,
Nope,
so you're
that's
going
okay.
to have to look at the screen. So you
Yeah.
see there, it says post-incident procedures,
yeah.
standard operating procedures. And I'm interested, let's look at paragraph 1.4. First of all, and you'll see that criteria for a post-incident investigation is covered in the APPAP. There's a reference to Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and a positive duty on police to carry out a comprehensive investigation into all deaths, whatever the cause.
Yeah.
And then can we go down to the bullet points just at the bottom of that? And it says, just before we go on to the bullet points, from the 1st of April 2013, Perk will, under direction from the Crown Office, conduct investigations into, it says, allegations of a criminal nature, death or serious injury in police custody, death or serious injury following police contact, police use of firearms and other weapons as specified in the regulations, and then another one about complaints.
Yeah.
Can you help us understand? We've heard that this SOP was adapted, and others have said, well, it wasn't a firearms situation. And we see there that one of the bullet points is about use of firearms,
Yep.
but it also appears to include death or serious injury following police contact. It
Yep.
doesn't mention anything about firearms there.
No.
And I'm wondering why there was this sense at the time that it was to be adapted because it didn't quite fit. Do you see what I mean? Can you help me understand why there was this impression that it had to be adapted? Because on the face of it, it does look like it's designed to deal with that situation where it says death following police contact.
Yeah. Can we just, sorry, can we go up to the top of it again,
Yes,
please?
yes, please do. Do you want to go right to the
Yeah,
top?
please, yeah.
If you feel you would find it easier to look at a hard copy
No,
of this, we
it's
can
fine.
do that.
It's absolutely fine.
Do you want it to the very top, or are you
Please,
happy
yeah.
with there? Yes, very top, please. And if we just start coming down, and you can tell us when you
No,
want
that's
us
fine.
to stop.
Yep. And sorry, and then does it have paragraphs in it in relation to the control of officers?
I think maybe what would be better is if we get hard copies of this, because it's we would anticipate, not prejudging what the chair will say, but we normally have a break at 11:30. So let's get a hard copy of this, and then you can have a chance to look at it and
Okay.
point us to the.
Yes.
And we'll
no
come
problem.
back to this after
Okay.
the break. Would that be?
Yeah,
all
that's
right?
absolutely fine.
Well, we'll come back to this and we'll get hard copies. Let's look at the minutes of the first Gold Group meeting, because I want to ask you about those. And those are PS 06491. And this, we've heard, is the agenda and contains the minutes of the first Gold Group meeting, which was at 11:30 in the morning on the 3rd of May 2015 at Kirkcaldy. And you see those on the screen.
I do.
And you're there as the chair, as Gold Commander. Chief Superintendent McEwen is there as Silver Commander. And also present Detective Chief Superintendent Bowl, Detective Superintendent Campbell, Chief Inspector Shepherd, Detective Inspector Robson, who took the minutes, and Kate Finlay, who we understand came from the media department. And then if we go on to look at those people, I'm interested in how you how the participants were selected. Now, you told us a moment ago that you and Gary McEwen had a conversation about who would be put in charge. But in terms of the participants, the people who were present, who decided who to invite to this meeting?
Well, it would be a discussion, but ultimately it would be myself that's agreed that these are the right people to have around the goal group meeting.
Right. And what was the purpose of all of these people being selected?
Well, so Chief Superintendent McEwen was silver. Leslie Bowell, in terms of the overall investigation and the support that was required. Pat Campbell in terms of the SIO, Chief Inspector Nicholas Shepherd in terms of public reassurance. Robson in terms of taking the minutes and his knowledge of what the investigation was, and Kate Finlay from a media perspective.
Now, we've heard that no one from Perk was present at that meeting.
No.
And you were aware, and others were aware, as I understand their evidence, that Perk were going to be leading on the investigation. Now, this is a number of hours after the incident took place, and at least a couple of hours since Perk were appointed. We've not heard evidence from Perk yet, but my understanding is it's a couple of hours since they were appointed to lead the investigation by the Crown Office.
Yep.
Can you recollect now why no one from Perk was present at that meeting?
Because I don't think they were available at that time.
And do you remember what the reason was that they were not available?
No, I don't, but I assume that by the time the fiscal had contact the Perk, and I assume that someone would have been on call, and that individual would pull together a team of some sort, presumably get an understanding of exactly what was happening and then attend. So that might take quite some time, but that'll be a question for themselves.
We've not heard from them yet,
No,
but we do hope to hear from them
Okay.
in the future hearing. Can you tell us what you thought of that, the fact that no one from Perk was present or online or remotely connected to the meeting?
No, I was quite comfortable at that stage. I mean, I'd worked with Perk previously, so and understand that it will take them a bit of time to pull together resources. They don't have a huge number of resources, so at 11:30, I wasn't concerned about that at all.
Were there any disadvantages to Perk not being present?
Well, from a Police Scotland perspective, we would want the Perk to be involved as quickly as possible. Provides reassurance to the public, the family, and everybody else that the inquiry is being investigated independently, objectively. And so the sooner they're there and they're taking control and command and leading, then the better for everybody.
And do you think that the fact they weren't present, that caused problems for Police Scotland?
I don't think necessarily at that stage. I think that's, as long as, so our task at that stage, Police Scotland's task at that stage, is to stabilise everything, make sure that nothing's lost, make sure that productions, vulnerable productions, if they're out in the weather, whatever happens to be, that these are seized, make sure that nothing happens to them, and basic stuff like, if CCTV is going to be lost or whatever, that we secure all of that and we make it available to the Perk when they arrive.
And you talk about stabilising. We've heard an expression used by another witness who said it was a foot on the ball moment. Is that really what you're saying? You use the word stabilise.
Yeah, I think stabilise is, so we want to stabilise everything. We want to make sure that everything's there, that nothing's lost, and that we can hand that over to the Perk when they're in a position to take that from us. So we have to carry out some investigation, and we have to carry on carrying out that investigation until they're in a position to take that over. So you can't afford to lose CCTV, you can't afford for anything to happen to productions. We were making sure that the police officers were, controlled and available for whoever was required. So that's our role at that stage. So that's what we were managing, that's what we were doing. So and then with an anticipation that the Perk would turn up at some near future time.
Did you have any understanding at this meeting as to how long it would take Perk to arrive?
No.
And can I also ask you about someone else who is not present there? We've heard some evidence that it can be useful to have professional standards at the Gold Group meetings, because there may be allegations. You're investigating a death after police contact. There may be allegations of criminal conduct by police officers. It's been declared a critical incident, and it's a good structure to have in place. And so professional standards may have a need to be aware of the circumstances and be thinking about the possibility of conduct, misconduct, possible disciplinary matters. Can you, we can see that professional standards weren't at the meeting.
Yes.
Can you help us understand, was there a decision taken not to include them, or was there a reason they were left out?
No, I can't recollect that. But as long as they're fully briefed about exactly what was going on, I would be quite comfortable with that. If they said they wanted to, when they were briefed that they would attend Gold Group meetings, then that would have been absolutely fine. I wouldn't have prevented that from happening and would have encouraged that. But I don't remember the conversation, to be honest. And but as long as they're fully briefed on exactly what's going on and that they're updated on any issues that unfold. And think they would be party to this discussion round about, the Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service and Perk involvement in any event.
When you say that you would encourage, what would the benefits of having professional
So
standards?
just that they would have that real understanding of exactly what was going on and when it was going on and who was doing what.
Do you think, looking back now, do you think it would be useful for them to be there at the first Gold Group meeting?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, as long as they're fully briefed and have an understanding of what's going on, then I think that's probably sufficient. But they might have a different view on that.
Who would be responsible for fully briefing professional standards?
So I assume that it was the SIO that briefed them, but I don't know. The answer is I don't know who briefed them, but I was aware that they were briefed.
And when did you become aware that they'd been briefed?
It would have been around the time of the Gold Group meeting, but I can't recollect.
We see the name Campbell, we see the name Robson there.
Yes.
We've heard from both officers. We've heard from Pat Campbell that he was SIO, and a number of other witnesses have given us that evidence. We've heard from Detective Inspector Robson that he was the on-duty, on-call SIO for Fife that day.
Yep.
Now, am I correct in understanding that there is only ever one SIO?
There's only one SIO, but straightforwardly, he would have been in the initial phase of this, the SIO, and then when Pat Campbell became involved, then he would become the deputy, and so he would give Pat Campbell an understanding of what's already happened, and then Pat Campbell would take over as SIO at that point.
So there's no such thing as a senior SIO and a SIO. There's an SIO, one SIO, and maybe a deputy SIO.
That's it.
All right, thank you. As Gold Commander, do you have authority to investigate, influence the actions of the SIO, or alter the course of the investigation, or require something to be included as part of the investigation?
If I felt that that was necessary, then obviously I do have the power to do that. But in the main, these are experienced people who you want to allow to get on with their work and their job. And unless something is going completely awry, and if it was, then I would obviously intervene.
We've heard them described, we've heard Campbell and Robson described as match fit and having a currency of experience in relation to investigations. Is that how you saw these officers?
Yes, I wouldn't describe it as match fit, but they definitely had the experience. There's no question about that. So I would have every confidence in them being able to carry out the investigation as it was required at that time. So again, it's it's this piece about stabilisation and the handover to the Perk. So absolutely no question in my mind about their abilities.
And in relation to your position as Gold Commander on this day, was there any point at which you intervened or sought to influence the course of the investigation?
No.
Now, I wonder if you could just give me a moment. Obviously, the chair is joining remotely,
Okay.
and I would like to invite him to consider maybe adjourning for the morning break.
Thank you.
So I'll just leave you for a moment, and
Yes,
I'll just approach
thank
the
you,
chair now,
thank you.
if I may. Thank you. And perhaps he can be brought back on the screen. Good morning. I wondered if this might be an appropriate time for our morning break.
Yes, we'll stop for 20 minutes now. Thank you. Miss Graham.
Thank you. I said I'd come back to a couple of things,
Yes.
but before I do that, I understand that there's some people in the hearing room that are having difficulty hearing.
Okay, sorry.
Now, I wondered, you're quite softly spoken, and I wondered if you would mind maybe bringing your microphone closer together, closer to you,
Yes.
and making sure that that is just at the point of your voice.
Okay.
And we'll see if that maybe
Helps.
helps the situation.
Sorry about
And
that.
no, not at all. And I'll try and get you to speak just a little bit louder. But I'm sure someone will tell me if the problem continues.
Please do.
All right, thank you. Now, I said to you just prior to the break that we would get a hard copy of the standard operating procedure, and I've also got a hard copy here. We can have this brought back up onto the screen. It may be, and I'll leave this to you, but paragraph 3.8 might be the one you were thinking about, but if you just tell me what the relevant part is, we'll just get this up on the screen now. So it's PS 10934. And I was asking you to help me understand why when there's bullet points about it applying to deaths after police contact, there seemed to be this impression that it only related to firearms incidents.
Yes. Well, so if you have a look at pages, the first few pages, then fairly obviously on page 4, paragraph 1.4, they talk about the various types of incidents. But when you get to paragraph 2 onwards in the document, and I've only had the opportunity to scan it when I was out for a few minutes there, but it talks about nothing else but firearms. So every paragraph will talk about the SFC, Strategic Commander, all the various bits, principal officers and referral criteria.
Right, can you make sure the microphone's quite near your mouth? Thank you. No, not at all. So a lot of the references within the body of the document are to firearms.
That's right.
And do you think that encouraged people to think that it only related to firearms, regardless of the fact there was other things mentioned at paragraph 1.4 about police contact and deaths?
Yeah, so the only reference to police contact and deaths is at page 4.
Let's look at page 4. Is this the page that I referred you to earlier?
It was, yes.
And that's the bullet points at the end where it specifically mentions deaths in police custody or following police contact.
That's correct, yes.
And so, as far as you're concerned, there was no other reference to those in the body of
I can't see any reference whatsoever. When you go in to look at the initial action and the other various paragraphs, it talks predominantly about firearms. So that's why people felt that it had to be adapted for the type of incident that we were dealing with. So it talks about who has to be present. It talks about firearms, people being present, and fairly obviously that wasn't appropriate in terms of what we were dealing with.
Looking back now, do you feel that this maybe wasn't as clear as it could have been in terms of the procedure?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we should have a document that clearly outlines the different aspects of what's referred to at page 4.
If there'd been different sections dealing with each of these bullet points, would that have assisted in terms of the understanding of how and when it should be implemented?
Yeah, I think that's correct, yes.
Thank you. And if people have said it only relates to firearms, can you understand that may not have been the correct impression, but it was an impression because of the content and the way the SOP is set out?
I think that's right, yes. It's the way it's set out, yes.
Thank you. Now, there's one other thing that I'd like to go back to very briefly, just to clarify in case there's any confusion. I asked you some questions about who was physically present at the scene, and we talked about the officers attending as a response team, that the acting police sergeant attended, and we talked about the PIO being remote in Kirkcaldy Police Office. And if anyone has the impression that you cannot take command or control remotely, would you agree that that's not the case? Because if, for example, it had been declared a firearms incident, that the control room inspector could have taken command and taken charge remotely?
Yes, I agree.
And would that also be the position if the inspector, the PIO, had said, I've got concerns about this incident, I'm going to take charge? Is that something he could have done remotely?
Yes.
And when we say remotely, could that have been communicated over airwaves, over the police radios?
It could.
Right. And in terms of the sergeant of the response team, is that something that he can also do, take command of a situation, even though he's not physically present at the scene?
He could, yes.
Thank you. Thank you for clearing that up. I think we were at the first Gold Group meeting minutes. And I'd like to go back to those, PS 06491. And I was asking you questions about those present at that meeting and
Yes.
those who weren't present. We've heard from a number of witnesses about something called a handover, where perhaps one person has been receiving all the information and then they hand it over to another who comes in to take over. And we've heard about that in relation to Police Scotland handing over to Perk. I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
I'm also interested in, we see here the name Detective Inspector Robson, who was the on-call duty SIO that day. And then we've heard from you that Detective Superintendent Campbell was the SIO.
Yes.
In terms of your expectations as Gold Commander, what would you envisage as a handover between Robson, who was initially on call, and then handing over to Campbell, who was then appointed by Leslie Bowl as SIO?
Well, so he would be the SIO in the initial phase of the investigation, and then Pat Campbell was appointed. And so initially I would expect that we had an SIO and a deputy SIO. I would expect the deputy SIO to fully brief the SIO in terms of what's already been undertaken, what the actions are, what staff are on the ground, and what investigations are being conducted.
Would you expect that to be in writing or face-to-face?
Face-to-face.
And
You could have done some of that by telephone conversation while Pat Campbell was en route. I honestly don't know the detail of that, but it's possible to do that, and it's possible to do it face-to-face, yeah.
so when we say face-to-face, it could also be by telephone. Which
Yes, yeah.
Would you expect there to be written records of that handover?
So I would expect there to be a policy document, and whether that details in that or not, I don't know, but it could be. But as long as there's a real understanding of what actions there are, and there would be a list of actions and tasks and what was going on in terms of the investigation. So that would be a continuation of what had already been taking place.
We've heard that Pat Campbell prepared a policy document. Would that accord with your understanding of procedure?
Yes, that's right.
I'm interested in one of the paragraphs in your inquiry statement, if I can ask. And this relates to a handover of strategic direction. So paragraph 226 of your inquiry statement, please. 226. I think the 4 p.m. meeting is just getting towards the end of the day. I would be Gold for the next 24 hours, no handover to another. Now, this is just before we come on to the second Gold Group meeting where you're being asked about. But I'm interested in this comment, I would be Gold for the next 24 hours, no handover to another. What about handover of the strategic direction of the investigation. You've talked about Gold Commander being in charge of strategic
Yes.
matters. What about a handover from you if you were only there for 24 hours?
Well, I was there for longer than 24 hours, so
So
I
what
suppose
does
what I
this
intended
mean?
from that was that I would have the next gold meeting the following day, and I had a gold meeting on the next 4 days, I think. So, so I didn't hand over to any other person. I mean, I kept gold command, and I kept gold command over these days.
So can I just be clear? You weren't only there for 24 hours.
No.
And is that simply a mistake then in that paragraph?
Well, I'm not sure it's a mistake, but it refers to the fact that I had a gold group meeting. I finished up, in the afternoon, and I would still be holding gold over that 24-hour period.
Right.
It's a reference to the fact that I wouldn't be handing over to someone for 8 hours or whatever. It's a reference to the fact that I was gold command and I would be retaining gold command.
I see. I just wanted to clear that up.
No, sorry, it doesn't seem very
No.
clear there.
So you were gold and remained gold
That's
for a
it.
period of time.
That's it.
And there wasn't any handover to someone
No,
else.
not at all. No.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look back at the minutes again, please? The 11:30 PSO 6491. And I'd like to look at item 1 on the agenda, so the terms of reference. Now, we've heard evidence about this from Gary McEwen, and you'll see the list in italics of different items that are, or bullet points, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And then at the end, the final one says, ensure the integrity, interest and reputation of the Police Service of Scotland and its staff is maintained and safeguarded.
Yeah.
And then underneath that in red, it says, agreed that wording of terms of reference would be considered and amended for future meetings to provide terminology specific to circumstances of incident.
Yes.
Do you remember this part of the meeting?
I do, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, so I would have asked for a gold strategy to be set out, and it looks like Gary McEwen has come up with points for the gold strategy, but I assume what he's done is gone to a previous meeting and lifted these terms of reference from that meeting. And that's fine for a starting point in terms of what we were doing. So we would sit down, we would review each one of the pointers. Could add strategic pointers in, or we could take some out during the course of the meeting, depending on what was required. And fairly obviously at the bottom, it was agreed that we would review the terms of reference to make them more specific to the circumstances that we were actually dealing with at that time.
What would be the purpose of having the final point there about ensuring the reputation of Police Scotland is safeguarded?
Well, so if we do all the right things, then we'll safeguard the reputation of Police Scotland. So it's making sure that everybody knows and understands what they need to be doing, and they do that, and that will maintain. But however, that's not, in my mind, the most important strategic intention here. And so for the next meeting, that point was removed completely.
And can you see that some people reading that may have concerns?
Yes,
that
I had concern reading it myself. So
right.
it's as I say, it's been lifted from another meeting. It's arguable whether it should have been taken out before we had the meeting, but from my point of view, the most important thing at that time was to get up and running, set out the strategic intention, make sure that everybody knew and understood what they were doing, make sure that we had the right resources in place, and with an anticipation that the Perk would arrive and take leadership of the inquiry, and then follow on from what we had already done. So, yeah.
Can I ask you, just to be clear, in your role as Gold Commander and the
Yeah.
approach that you took to the Gold Command,
Yeah.
was any part of that, or any part of the actions you took, designed to protect the reputation of Police Scotland?
No.
Thank you. And do you remember, it says there, agreed that the wording would be considered and amended.
Yes.
Do you remember if anyone else raised this issue with you at
Oh,
that meeting?
No, I can't remember at that stage.
Thank you. We've heard from Leslie Bowl that it's one of her, or was one of her pet hates, as she described it. She didn't like to see that reference to reputation in the terms of reference.
Yes.
Would you have similar concerns to
Yes.
that, especially in an incident involving a death after police contact?
That is not the most important thing in terms of this kind of investigation. So when the investigation is carried out thoroughly and objectively, and if there are difficulties with the reputation of Police Scotland at that time, we'll understand what that is and we can do something about it at that stage. But that should not be the most an important consideration in terms of a strategic intent.
And if there's concerns about the reputation of Police Scotland, what would you do?
Well, it was if any particular aspect of it was brought to my attention, or I saw it for myself, then I would do something about it at that point in time.
Can you give the Chair an example of something that might be raised with you?
I can't really know, but
no. Looking at the terms of reference and the strategy that was being adopted,
yes.
And thinking now about the reassurance to be given to the family, but also to the community.
Yes.
What more do you think could have been done to give reassurance to the community in relation to this incident?
Well, it's about engaging with the various aspects of what's there. So the family, the various communities, engagement with them, providing them with as much information as you can without breaching any confidentiality in terms of the investigation itself.
Thank you. By this stage of the day, at the first Gold Group meeting, what was your understanding about the identity of the male who had died? Did you know or have an impression as to who it was?
Yes, well, I didn't know the person, but obviously I was told who it was, yes.
So by this first Gold Group meeting, were you aware it was Mr. Bayoh? Or
Yes,
that was...
yes.
Yes. Were you aware by this meeting how Mr. Bayoh had been identified as the male who died?
No, I don't think so.
Were you aware of any concerns in relation to the method of identification? We've heard evidence from Colette Bell that she had phoned the police at about 8:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
She'd had a call from a friend of Mr. Bayoh, Mr. Sahid, and she couldn't find her partner. She'd gone back home, she couldn't find her partner. There was some disarray at home, and she'd contacted the police. Do you know anything about the method of identification at all?
I don't, but I assume it was through the initial investigation. So.
And who would be carrying those out?
Well, so the local police officers, and then under D.I. Robson, from a CID, criminal investigation perspective.
So when it says at the top of this, if we go right back to the top of these minutes, or combined sort of minutes, when it says death of unidentified male, was he still unidentified at that
so
time?
I assume there's no formal identification at that stage. So.
And what would be required for a formal identification?
Well, so physical identification or DNA at some stage.
What's involved with a physical identification?
Well, member of the family identifying.
Is that how it's commonly done?
So that's how it's commonly done, yes.
We've heard that sometimes the family will go prior to the post-mortem.
That's right, yes.
And identify the person.
That's right, yes.
Is that what you expected to happen here?
Well, it would depend on the circumstances as the SIOs saw it, but normally that's exactly what would happen, yes.
And then if we can look down, we see that a factual update, item 2, was given by Detective Inspector Robson. We've heard that he knew something of the circumstances at that time and gave the update. Do you remember that happening?
Yes,
And Colette Bell is mentioned on the next page, final paragraph of item 2. She provided details of an incident that occurred prior to the police and involvement which led to identification of male. Was that your understanding?
Yes,
And then item 3, investigative process. And the names next to this are DCS Bowl and Detective Superintendent Campbell.
Yep.
And it says initial actions and investigation strategy outlined by Detective Superintendent Campbell in respect of the following areas. So is Campbell giving a summary here?
Yes. So
you can effectively approve his strategy, or you can contribute to the strategy?
Yes, that's right. So it's an update.
So he gives an update, and is there a general discussion amongst the members of the Gold Group?
Potentially as he went through each item, but I would have expected to see something about a discussion about the various items if in fact there had been discussion around about them. So,
and we see a number of priority actions there, statements to be taken from Martin Dick and Saeed Saeed, independent witnesses speaking to male with knife. 4 loci had been identified and they were to be secured.
yeah.
A number of other things. Now I want to ask you in relation to one of the bullet points, which is number 9. So it begins with the word CT considerations. Now I'll read this out and then I'm going to ask you to look at your inquiry statement. It'll be paragraph 40, but we'll have it on the screen.
Yep.
You can have it as we go through it. So the minutes here say CT considerations raised by ACC and to be reviewed by NIB. And that's what I'm going to ask you about. Let's look at paragraph 40, first of all, of your inquiry statement. And you were asked by the inquiry statement about this matter. I have been asked if the race of the individual could be a basis for understanding this to be a terrorist attack. No. I have been told the officers' Perk statements suggest Sheku Bayoh being black factored into their understanding of what incident they were going to. I have been asked if this is what I was intending with the memo. Absolutely not. For years, the highest threat from terrorism in Scotland was Irish-related terrorism. Race, colour of skin, whatever, is not an issue in terms of what was intended from this. Now, I know that at this time, and we've heard evidence that you had a particularly high role in relation to counter-terrorism. I don't want to really ask you about that. I want to focus specifically on your role as Gold Commander at this particular incident. And so any questions I ask in relation to that really are about your role that day at the Gold Group meetings, rather than any other information that you may have become aware of as a result of your other role in relation to being head of counter-terrorism. So bearing that in mind, what I am interested in is why you raised, or you are said in the minutes to have raised an issue about counter-terrorism, and whether that had any particular reference to the fact that Mr. Bayoh was a black man.
Yes.
All right.
So it had no reference to that whatsoever. So the information that we had at that stage was that an attack was likely from a lone individual who would be potentially carrying a knife. And there had been a number of incidents across the world at that time. So we had Australia, Canada, Paris, and we had Copenhagen, when 5 police officers were injured during an attack. And that's what stimulated the memo in terms of all of that, outlining what it was that police officers needed to be cognizant of. But it bore nothing in relation to ethnicity, apart from the modus operandi, which was to be a lone individual with a knife, or a bladed weapon, as police jargon, and that it would be an attack on members of the public or on uniformed personnel.
And we've heard from Gary McEwen in evidence. He said there was never anything at any point that suggested this was terrorism.
No,
and
that's right.
You agree with that?
I agree with that.
So never at any point was there a suggestion it was terrorist related?
That's correct.
It was mentioned by you in the minutes and raised by you in the minutes. And we understand that there were some checks done
Yes.
on the back of what you've said at the Gold Group meeting.
Yeah.
But there was never any basis for suggesting it was terrorist related.
No. To the contrary, it was to suggest that it wasn't terrorist. So what I wanted to do was get messages out to our own people, but also to communities to say, this is not a terrorist-related matter. So various communities at that stage, with all the events, the number of racially motivated incidents were up, and we were at pains to make sure that we could alleviate any concerns. So what I wanted to do was, say this is not terrorism related, and so that we then quell any fears whatsoever, and we try to make sure that we don't have a spike in racially motivated incidents at that time.
Did you have a concern at this time that the public may have concerns that because Mr. Bayoh was black, that it was possibly a terrorist-related event?
Well, I don't know whether the public. Well, I suppose that's right. And some sections of the public may well have believed that, and we saw that from the events that I've actually spoken about in Sydney, Australia, in Canada, Paris, Copenhagen. So we saw, a spike in racially motivated incidents. So it's just trying to make sure, in terms of community concerns, that we alleviate that concern. We make sure that everybody knows and understands that that's not what we have here, and that wasn't what we had here.
And we've heard evidence from a number of witnesses about how hypotheses are developed as part of the investigation.
Yes.
And that the hypotheses in relation to counter-terrorism was this one of the hypotheses that could be very quickly excluded by the checks that you asked to be carried out?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I go back to some of the other bullet points here that we see in item 3 of the agenda and the minutes, which is PS 06491. And we see that it says loci.
Yes.
4 loci identified and to be secured. And then here we have Hayfield Road, where the incident occurred, Colette Bell's home address, Arran Crescent. Deceased at Victoria Hospital, and home address of Martin Dick. There's no mention at this stage in the Gold Group meeting of Zaid Saheed's family home. So there's 4 loci identified there. What were your expectations as Gold Commander in relation to how these properties or these loci would be secured?
Well, police officers would attend and secure the property.
And what would be the basis or the authority on which properties would be secured?
Well, it'd be part of the investigation, ongoing investigation, so that would have to be justified by the SIO, but yeah.
And when you say secured, what does that mean to a police officer, securing a property?
Well, it means that the police have control of the address, that nobody else can get access to the address or get access to the address.
And we've heard about officers turning up doing something called locus protection and having a scene entry log.
Yes.
And noting who goes in and out. Is that the type of thing you would expect officers to be doing?
That's absolutely what they should be doing.
And it would be the SIO who would identify those addresses that were to be secured.
Yes.
And we've heard about the police having the ability to seek a warrant for a property.
Yes.
Or alternatively, they can seek consent from the occupants or the occupiers.
Yes.
What were your expectations at this stage in the day about what the police would do, what the SIO would do in terms of securing these properties?
So I would have no input to that whatsoever. I was just interested in what was ongoing. You've got 2 SIOs and Leslie Bowl who are highly experienced, and so they're telling us at the Gold Group that these are the loci that need to be secured. So I accept that that's the case. And
was it your expectation that that would be taken forward by Pat Campbell as SIO and that the proper authorities or consents would be in place?
Absolutely.
We've heard that the Gold meetings are at quite a high level.
Yes.
And they maybe don't go into the minutiae. Would you call whether it's a warrant or consent, would that be part of the minutiae?
It would be, yes. But
sorry, that's maybe
so sometimes, I mean,
the small detail, perhaps I should have said.
You can't control what people really talk about at the Gold Group meeting, so we will end up with some minutiae. But you know, there's a reasonable expectation on my part that an SIO with the experience that Pat Campbell has will know how to go about getting the authority to search whatever property is that needs to be searched.
And was it part of your expectation that that authority would be obtained some way, either by warrant or
absolutely.
by consent?
Yes, of course.
In relation to the bullet point regarding FLO, it says establish a working strategy. Do you remember the discussion about FLOs? What were your expectations in relation to that?
Well, so that we would deploy FLOs to the family, identify who the best FLOs were in terms of that, and then deploy them.
When you say we would deploy, are you talking about Police Scotland?
I'm talking about Police Scotland, yes.
Was it any part of your expectation that Perk would provide the FLOs?
Well, that should be a discussion between the SIO and the Perk to make sure that we know and understand what elements of the investigation they're going to carry out. Because at the end of the day, the Perk are going to only have a few resources, and they're going to rely on Police Scotland to provide resources for certain aspects of the investigation. So, but that's a discussion with the Perk, and the Perk deciding what it is that they're going to deploy to and what they want us to support in terms of carrying out the investigation.
Who was going to be tasked with establishing a working strategy for the FLOs?
So Pat Campbell would delegate that to either his deputy or one of the other officers that would be under his command.
And when did you expect that FLOs would actually be deployed to deal with the family?
Well, as soon as possible.
So this is a meeting at 11:30 in the morning.
Yes.
Mr. Bayoh was taken by ambulance from Hayfield Road at 7:30 in the morning. You've got this meeting at 11:30. When would you be expecting the FLOs as soon as possible to be sent out to the family?
So presumably, so I don't know whether there would be FLOs readily available in the area at that time, so that might take some time to actually have FLOs out and on the ground, but you could start to build a working strategy prior to that, and when they then attend, you could deploy the FLOs.
So did you have any sort of time scale in mind that
No.
you could help the chair to understand?
No, I don't. I mean, it depends. If there were FLOs on duty, then that could be quite quick. But if there's no FLOs on duty, then they would have to be recalled to duty and then briefed and then deployed. So that could take quite some time. But I don't know the detail of that.
All right. The second last bullet point is police officer statements. Federation reps providing advice to officers concerned regarding this matter. Do you recall this part of the update and discussion?
Well, so my understanding was that the officers were refusing to give statements at that point.
You knew that by then?
I think so, yeah.
And what was the strategy in relation to that? How did that strategy develop then, knowing that the police officers were refusing to give statements?
Well, so I would expect that they were asked to provide, initial operational statements, and if they refused to do that, then the investigation must carry on. So it'll be undertaken in a different way from having the statements.
So was it your expectation that they would have been asked to provide operational statements?
Yes.
And would it surprise you if we've heard evidence that they weren't actually asked to provide them?
I would be surprised.
And what would you have expected to have been done?
Well, purely and simply ask them if they were going to provide operational statements.
Would that be individually or collectively?
Well, they were all together in the canteen, so it would be a case of someone asking them to provide operational statements at that stage.
Let's deal with officers who maybe were in the canteen but had not taken part in the restraint.
Yes.
Who had not used any force as part of the events in Hayfield Road. And for those officers, if they've been told they're witnesses, not suspects, was there any leverage that could be used by Police Scotland to get statements from them? Operational statements, basic facts?
Well, leverage is a very difficult thing. If we've got to leverage people into giving statements, that can cause difficulty at some later stage. That's not any different for a police officer or a member of the public. So I think it's asking people to give statements and outlining their obligation, I suppose, to provide a statement. But at the end of the day, if someone refuses to give a statement, then I'm not sure how you can compel them or leverage them into giving a statement.
You say outlining their obligation to give a statement. What obligations are or were on police officers at that time to give?
It's incumbent on them to provide an operational statement, and I think in terms of the firearms, it's an initial account. So from my perspective, either one, as long as they give some account of the initial stages of what took place, then that's fine.
And you said you can't compel them. So as other than asking and outlining their obligation,
Yes.
you would take the view that if they refuse, that's not something you can push against in any way?
Well, it depends. At some stage, you expect that police officers, so at that stage, they're not going to provide operational statements, but you expect at some stage they are going to provide statements. And so what you don't want to do is undermine that by, threatening discipline or, whatever it happens to be. So I think, so not any different to any other inquiry that you would have. You don't get a statement from the individual. You work your way around that. So you go and you get the CCTV, you all various other aspects. And it actually, in terms of the interview, you might be better informed, you might have a better interview strategy once you've actually collected all that information. So witness statements, CCTV footage, all the various aspects of that, and then you're better equipped to carry out a thorough forensic interview with the individual, so know and understand exactly what's happened and taken place.
And for those officers who were gathered in the canteen who maybe had used some level of force at Hayfield Road that day, we've heard evidence that they maybe have been concerned about their status. Mm-hmm. We've heard evidence about whether they were witnesses or suspects. And we've also heard that they may have been concerned that that position may change as the investigation progressed.
Yes.
Is that something that you were advised about at the first Gold Group meeting, that there may have been these concerns?
No, I think what we were told was that they were refusing at that point to provide statements. So, and of course they would have concerns, but a police officer knows that it's incumbent on them to give an initial account or an initial statement. It's not, doesn't go into a huge amount of detail. The detail will come later, but of course they would have concerns, yeah.
And was that something that was raised at the Gold Group meeting?
No, I don't. Well, it might have been, but I don't recollect anything being raised in relation to that.
Thank you. I'm interested in forensic considerations. You'll see the final bullet point there. Forensic considerations, officers' clothing and PPE to be taken possession of. So what was your expectation in relation to that matter, forensic considerations?
Yeah, so just exactly what it says there, that the SIO obviously wanted to seize the officers' clothing and PPE. So, my understanding of that is that that's what would take place.
And did you have any expectations about when this would be carried out?
No, not really. I mean, the sooner it's carried out, the better, I suppose, in terms of evidence, forensics, if that's what subsequently was wanting to be undertaken. But
and who would be responsible for implementing that?
Well, the SIO.
SIO. And again, presumably that wouldn't be something he'd do personally, but he would
not at all.
appoint someone to do that.
Yes, exactly.
And you said, if I remember correctly, something about the sooner it was done, the better. Did you have an impression of how long it would take for that to be done?
No, not at all.
Any hindrances that you were aware of or that were raised that would prevent that being done quickly?
No, I can't recollect anything.
We've heard evidence that it was a number of hours before that was actually done.
Right.
Does that cause you any concern?
Well, it would have been much better to do it. If we know at that stage that that's what we want to do, then it would be much better to undertake it as quickly as we can. But we would want, fairly obviously, to have clothing and for the officers. So I don't know how that's been undertaken, but it may well be that they had to go to officers' homes or wherever. I don't know, but I don't have the answers to that, but someone else will.
Someone else would have been responsible for the operational tasks that were required to recover the clothing.
Absolutely.
And the equipment.
Yes.
We've heard evidence that some of the clothing and equipment was in the canteen, left lying on the floor, leaning against walls, on a table. Do you have any concerns about that?
Yes, well, that shouldn't have been so. But this is back to what I'd said some time ago about getting a grip of what was going on in the canteen.
What would you have expected to happen with the equipment or clothing that was lying about?
Well, I would expect each of the officers to have their clothing and PPE beside them in initial parts of that, and then when we spoke about, to be taken possession of, then that would be taken possession of from there.
We've heard a suggestion that it would have been possible for equipment to be kept in a separate room or kept in a separate area away from the canteen, which had people walking about and moving about. What do you think of that suggestion?
Well, yeah, if it's kept separate in a separate room, then fairly obviously that would be beneficial. But if it's just put into one room, then you've got the same forensic concerns as you would have if it was lying about in the canteen.
Right.
So it's back to getting a grip of that and taking possession of the clothing and the PPE as soon as possible.
Thank you. And in terms of recovering clothing or equipment, we've heard about the role of Pat Campbell.
Yeah.
As the SIO. We've also discussed Conrad Trickett's presence as post-incident manager.
Yeah.
And I'm interested, in terms of recovering of clothing or equipment, would they both have a potential role, or would it be one or the other?
So the SIO would want possession of the clothing and PPE in terms of forensics and whatever had to be undertaken. So he could either delegate that to Conrad Trickett or delegate that to one of his own CID officers.
So Campbell, as SIO, could have delegated it to Conrad Trickett.
Absolutely.
That was an option open to him.
Absolutely.
Would it have been any responsibility of Conrad Trickett to volunteer to gather in equipment or sort of offer?
Not really. I don't think. I think it's the SIO, whether the SIO wants to secure clothing and PPE. So it'll depend on whether there's investigative advantage of gathering that kind of gathering the clothing and the PPE. So, but that's a decision. Initially, a decision for the SIO and how they're secured. So, are they forensically secured? And then to delegate that to whoever it is that's going to secure the clothing and the PPE.
So it's within the discretion of the SIO to decide who's maybe best placed to organise the forensic recovery.
Yes.
We've heard some evidence about a particular vest that one of the officers was wearing and a mark or marks that were on that vest. Was that something that was discussed at any point in the Gold Group?
No, I don't recollect that at all.
No. Was there ever a discussion about possibly collecting soil or surface traces from the road where it happened? No.
And I wouldn't expect that level of detail. I don't think at the Gold Group meeting I would expect the SIO to be getting on with, and forensics to be getting on with, whatever it was that they thought they required in terms of the investigation.
Thank you. Let's move on to item 4, please. Review of policy decision log. And I think everyone has a discussion about this. Only policy decision made at that time was in relation to Chief Superintendent McEwen declaring the situation a critical incident at 0910. Also recognition that the circumstances would be investigation by the Perk.
Yeah.
And I think you've said earlier today you were aware that Perk would be involved.
Yes.
From the moment Mr. Bayoh died, really.
Yes.
I'm interested at this time of the day, so at the first Gold Group meeting, what your understanding was as to the scope of the investigation by Perk. We've heard evidence that, and we've not heard from Perk yet, we've not heard from the Crown yet, but there's some evidence available to the chair that suggests that the role of Perk and the nature of the investigation expanded as time went on. And I'm interested in what your understanding was at that time about what they would be doing.
Well, at that stage, I don't think they had attended at Kirkcaldy office, because I think that so they could have been there for quite some time, but their attendance, or when I became aware of their attendance, I think that stimulated the second goal group meeting.
So Perk haven't turned up to that meeting?
No.
They're not at that meeting?
No.
So do you feel that at that stage, at that first gold group meeting, you had a clear idea of what the scope of their investigation would be?
No.
No. And did that have an impact on what you could do as Gold Commander at this first gold group meeting? Well,
as I said before, our role is about stabilisation and making sure that no evidence is lost. The SIO has identified a number of locations, and so it's securing all of that and waiting for a Perk senior investigator to attend, have a discussion with the SIO and decide, as I said previously, what actions the Perk are going to undertake and what actions the Police Scotland are going to undertake. So you would expect the Perk to undertake the investigation round about Hayfield Road, close proximity to the incident, and in terms of house to house, extended house to house, it may well be that they were comfortable with Police Scotland undertaking house to house, securing locations. But at the end of the day, it's Perk are leading the investigation, so it's for them to determine at that moment in time what it is that they're going to do and what it is that Police Scotland are going to do.
And in terms of the role of Perk, am I right in understanding your answers that Perk would be dealing with the actual incident and maybe the lead up to the incident?
Yeah, well, that's my personal take on it.
Yeah.
You need to ask them in terms of what they believed their part of the investigation was. But as I said before, we need Police Scotland need the Perk to be there on the ground, be leading the investigation, directed by the Crown, and to carry out the actions that they believe are important from their perspective, because we need the investigation to be as objective and independent as it possibly can, and then wait the outcome of their investigation to understand, exactly what happened and whether Police Scotland did everything they possibly could, or whether Police Scotland got something or something is wrong.
Can I ask you to look at COPFS 02539? Now, this should be a letter from Crown Office to Perk, dated the 5th of May 2015. So it's 2 days after Mr. Bayoh died. And we've not heard evidence about this letter yet, but we have it available. And I'm going to use it as a way of asking you some further questions about the role of Perk.
Yep.
Could we look at the body of this letter, which is, as I say, from Crown Office to Perk? And it's what I would call a letter of instruction, setting out Crown Office's authority being given to Perk to carry out the investigation. And you'll see in the second paragraph, it says there are 2 areas which require investigation. These are 1, the circumstances leading up to the incident, namely Mr. Bayoh's movements late on Saturday 2nd May and during the early hours of Sunday 3rd May, prior to the contact with police, including his attendance at a house and this is the house of a witness we've heard evidence from, Martin Dick, who lived there at the time with his then fiancée Kirsty MacLeod, now his wife, and events following his attendance there, and 2, the incident in which the police became involved with Mr. Bayoh shortly after 7 a.m. on the 3rd of May. So from the 5th of May, it would appear that the Crown Office have given authority to Perk to investigate two areas leading up to the incident in the early hours,
Yep.
but also the incident at Hayfield Road. But that appears to be an extension. We've not heard from evidence from them yet, but appears to be an extension. And on the 3rd of May, as far as we know at the moment, they were only asked to investigate the interaction between the police and the deceased at the time of his arrest and the events thereafter. So it would appear initially they were asked to look at events in Hayfield Road. In this letter dated the 5th, they were asked to look at the events leading up to it. Were you aware on the 3rd of May that, as far as we know, on that date, they were only asked to look at the events in Hayfield Road?
No, I wasn't aware of that, but what I would say from my own experience is that it's really difficult just to focus on the incident without considering all the other aspects of it, which obviously they've got to on the 5th of May. But as I said before, they've got a statutory responsibility to investigate deaths in custody in the circumstances that we're talking about here. So, you know, you could argue that the death in custody is, you know, in the location at Hayfield Road, but I'm not sure how you can carry out an investigation without knowing and understanding how the individual got there, Mr. Bayoh got there, why he was there, and all the various aspects of that, all the, you know, police, radio communications, everything else around about it. So it's difficult to see how they would be able to undertake a thorough, objective investigation without considering the various aspects that are in that letter of the 5th.
And in terms of your understanding on the 3rd as Gold Commander, was it brought to your attention in any way, at any time that day, that the remit of Perk appeared to be just in relation to Hayfield Road and the events at Hayfield Road?
No.
How practical would that have been? Would the police have continued with investigating events prior to Hayfield Road and Perk take over the Hayfield Road investigation?
It's just not practical at all. I mean, I just can't see how they need to CCTV round Hayfield Road, you know, and that'll take, if there's CCTV round Hayfield Road, then that's presumably going to take them to CCTV prior to that, you know. So either Police Scotland are going to carry out that part of the investigation, and then the Perk are going to carry out the limited investigation, and then at some stage that's all going to have to be joined together. But the appropriate way, in my opinion, to carry that out is for one person to be in charge of the whole thing. We, as Police Scotland, can carry out whatever investigation the Perk wants. So CCTV sees that, you know, whatever productions, but as long as it's under the auspices, direction of one person, that's what you would look for. I think it's very difficult to discern, you know, one element of the investigation and then, you know, the rest. Where does it join together, and where's the differentiation along Hayfield Road of where the police start the investigation and where the Perk end their investigation?
We heard evidence from Leslie Bowl, and she said she was under the impression that Perk would deal with the whole investigation, all the matters, but they would be supported as required by Police Scotland.
100%, yes.
Does that accord with your understanding that day?
Absolutely.
Thank you. If there's a suggestion that on the 3rd of May, so the day that Mr. Bayoh died, we've heard evidence that Mr. Dick's house was secured as one of the loci that had been identified. If there's a suggestion that that was Police Scotland that were investigating that, because it related to matters in the lead up, you know, it wasn't related to Hayfield Road and the matters there.
Yeah.
And that was all down to Police Scotland. Was that your impression at the time?
Now, my impression at the time was that it would be an overall investigation led and directed by the Perk. Now, fairly obviously, if that's not what they were directed at the initial stages, they were eventually directed to that. It feels like, from my perspective, it feels like, you know, that's what they ought to have been doing in the first place, understanding the circumstances.
Thank you. Let's go back to the minutes, if we may, and item 5 on the agenda. It's at the bottom. There we are. And this is family concerns spoken to by Detective Inspector Robson. And it says circumstances discussed regarding Colette Bell contacting police and being informed that male believed to be her partner, Sheku Bayoh, was deceased but subject to formal identification. I think we touched on that earlier. She provided details of next of kin, his sister, who she did not have contact with her, decision to be made re-flow deployment by MIT MIT officers. And what was, do you remember this part of the discussion?
Yeah, I do.
Tell us about your recollection.
It was just an update in terms of what, you know, his partner was informed that her partner was deceased, but there had to be formal identification carried out. And then when she goes on to detail the next of kin, and then there's discussion about the flow deployment by the MITs. And
flow deployment by MITs is Police Scotland officers.
Yes, it would be.
And that deployment of a flow was to be done by them.
Yes, that's.
Was this part of the working strategy that was to be developed?
Well, so the MITs presumably had flow officers available, and then that wouldn't be the working strategy, but the working strategy would be developed from that, the fact that they were to be deployed.
And it says she provided details of next of kin, his sister, she didn't have contact with. So in terms of that entry there in the minutes, it appears she gave details to the police as to the next of kin. Yes. What were your expectations, knowing that Colette Bell we've heard she was in Kirkcaldy police office at the time, had provided details of the next of kin?
So that the next of kin would be engaged with, informed of the death, and then flows deployed.
Did you have a view at that stage about how long that would take?
No, not at all. I mean, in terms of gold, you need to allow the officers to undertake their role in terms of their expertise. So, as I said before, it depends where the flows were coming from, by the time they get brief, by the time the strategy is developed, and then they're actually deployed. So that could take a bit of time, a fair bit of time.
We've heard that the next of kin, his sister, weren't told until round about 3:10 there or thereafter in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So Mr. Bayoh was taken away from Hayfield Road in an ambulance at 7:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
A critical incident is declared at 9:10 in the morning.
Yeah.
The first Gold Group meeting is at 11:30. By then, the police have discussed or are discussing matters with Colette Bell in Kirkcaldy Police Office, and she's given details of next of kin.
Yep.
We've heard from other police officers that they had concerns about the delay in speaking to the next of kin, which I've said we've heard took place after 3:10. Do you also have concerns about that timescale for the flows going to the family?
Yes, so, well, initially the family ought to be told of the death by someone other than the flow, and then the flows should be deployed. So it seems a long time.
Sorry, I don't understand. Could you give me one moment?
Yes,
please?
certainly.
Thank you. Sorry, I've perhaps said some misspoken. It wasn't the flows who went at 3:10 or thereabouts.
Yeah.
That was 2 DCs who went to deliver the death message. So, in fact, the situation is that there was an even greater delay than I've suggested to you. I suggested to you the flows went at 3:10, and that's not correct.
No,
I misspoke about that. But do you continue to have concerns?
Yes, I do.
Perhaps
Yep.
even greater concerns about the delays in flows becoming involved with the next of kin?
I do.
Yeah. And what were those concerns about the impact of not sending flows in to speak to the family?
Well, I mean, the first thing we need to do is deliver the death message, and 2 DCs or detective officers anyway. I don't know whether they were DCs or DSs, but delivering the death message, that's appropriate, and then the flow is being deployed after that. So, but the timescales are very long and should have been much shorter than what's happened.
We heard evidence from an earlier witness who said he thought it was wholly inappropriate for the delays in relation to the flows becoming involved with the family. Would you agree with that?
I think that's right, yes.
Now, I'm conscious of the time. Would you give me a moment,
Yes,
please? And I'd like to address the chair about the time. Thank you. I'm conscious that it's close to lunchtime now, and I wonder if this might be an appropriate moment to adjourn.
Yes, we'll stop for lunch and we'll sit again at 2 o'clock. Thank you.